Rosalie Bennett pressed her back against the cold kitchen wall and ate cold gristle from a cracked wooden bowl scraps she had pulled from the slop bucket before the pigs got them, while 30 men sat 20 feet away, laughing and scraping clean the plates she had cooked since 4 in the morning. She could hear them through the wall. She could smell the stew she'd stirred for 3 hours. Her hands were shaking, not from hunger, from the knowledge that she had let this become so normal she no longer cried about it. If you've ever worked yourself down to nothing while others took everything and never once said, "Thank you, this story is for you," hit that subscribe button right now and follow Rosalie's story all the way to the end. Because I promise you, it goes somewhere you won't expect. And drop a comment below, tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that kitchen. Back to the woman nobody saw. She had been invisible for so long she'd almost stopped noticing. Almost. Rosalie Bennett was 27 years old. And she had been the cook at Dawson Creek Ranch for 4 years. 3 months and 11 days. She knew the exact count because she had started marking the days on the inside of her kitchen cabinet door during the second winter, when the nights got long enough that she needed something to hold on to, some proof that time was moving, that she was not simply standing still inside a life that had quietly closed around her like a trap she hadn't seen until the door had already shut. The ranch sat in the wide flat valley south of the Musselshell River in Montana Territory. And in the summer of 1871, the heat came down on it like a judgment. The range grass turned pale and crackling. The creek roads went to powder. The cattle moved slow and irritable under a sky that had forgotten what a cloud looked like. And the 32 men who worked Dawson Creek complained about all of it, morning to night, loudly, to anyone within earshot. Rosalie heard every word of it. She heard everything from the kitchen. She was always in the kitchen. 4 in the morning, the fire. 4:15, the bread dough. 4:40, the first pot of coffee, strong enough to stand a spoon in. Because the men who rolled out of the bunkhouse before sunrise were not human yet and required strong coffee before they became so. Biscuits in the oven by 5, salt pork in the pan. Eggs when the hens cooperated, which, in summer heat, was less often than the men would have liked, and they let her know it. As though the temperament of laying hens was a matter she could personally address. Breakfast done, dishes washed, fire restoked. Then the planning for noon, what she had, what she could make from it, how to stretch $3 worth of provisions into a meal that would fill 32 men who worked with their bodies and came to the table with the appetites of men who worked with their bodies. She was extraordinary at it. Nobody told her that. They told each other. Best biscuits in the territory, Earl Dobbs said every single morning, loud enough for the table to hear, on his third biscuit, the one he took when he thought nobody was watching. Woman can cook, the others agreed, nodding, wiping their mouths, pushing their chairs back. Not one of them looked toward the kitchen when they said it. Rosalie stood behind that wall and heard those words pass through it and felt nothing. The way you feel nothing when you've heard something so many times without anything attached to it that the words have worn smooth. Like riverstones present, but no longer capable of catching on anything. She had a large frame, wide through the hips and shoulders, with strong hands and a broad back built for exactly the kind of work she did. She had dark hair she kept pinned up because loose hair and a hot stove were a combination she'd learned early not to risk. And brown eyes that, in another life, in a life where someone had bothered to look at them, might have been described as warm. Nobody at Dawson Creek described her eyes. Nobody at Dawson Creek described anything about her except, occasionally, her size, and those descriptions were not ones she stored anywhere she intended to keep. Harland Pierce had made the terms of her employment clear within the first week. He was a tall, lean man, Harland Pierce, with a jaw like a plank of hardwood and eyes the color of water that hadn't moved in a long time. He owned Dawson Creek Ranch, the way certain men owned things as though ownership were a natural condition of their existence, rather than a circumstance they'd arrived at. And the things they owned, land and cattle and buildings and employees, existed in the same category in his mind, which was the category of assets to be managed toward maximum utility. He had come to the kitchen on her 5th day and stood in the doorway and looked at her the way a man looks at a piece of equipment he's not entirely satisfied with, but hasn't yet decided to replace. "You'll eat after the men," he said. "Portions I approve." That's the arrangement. Rosalie had been 23 years old. New to the ranch, 2 weeks out of Billings, where her mother had just died and left behind nothing but debt and a rented room that needed vacating. She had cooking skills and a strong back and $11. When Harlan Pierce offered her wages and a roof, she had said yes before she'd thought clearly about what yes meant. "Yes, sir," she'd said on her 5th day. She had not known, standing in that kitchen at 23, what 4 years of yes would cost her. By the 2nd year, she knew the arithmetic. The portions Harlan approved were not enough for a woman doing what Rosalie did. She was on her feet 17 hours a day. She hauled water, split kindling, scrubbed cast iron, kneaded dough, stirred vats, carried loaded dishes across a dining room that seated 50 at full capacity. She burned more in a morning than most of those ranch hands burned in a full day. And she was being fed less than a man half her size, who spent his afternoons on a fence post watching cattle drift. She had started supplementing quietly. Bread heels before they hit the slop bucket, gristle too small to plate, biscuit edges that crumbled during baking. She ate standing up, in the corner of the kitchen where the light was worst. Quickly, the way you eat, when you're doing something you've decided, doesn't count as eating. She had told herself it was temporary. She had told herself things would improve. She had been telling herself both those things for 4 years. Then, on the morning of July the 11th, Calvin Rhodes came into the kitchen before breakfast service and stood at the work table and watched her work for a moment, before he said anything. Which was always how Calvin began conversations. He wanted to feel like accidents. Calvin was the ranch foreman, barrel-chested, permanently squinting. The kind of man who had spent so many years being second most important in every room that he had developed a finely tuned hostility toward anyone he perceived as receiving attention he hadn't authorized. "Pierce wants to see you after breakfast," Calvin said. Rosalie kept moving. "What about? Your bread's coming out heavy." She stopped. She looked at him. "My bread," she said, "is not coming out heavy. Pierce says it is. Pierce hasn't been in this kitchen in 2 weeks." Calvin shrugged a slow, deliberate shrug that communicated indifference as a weapon. "Man's the boss. His opinion on your bread is the one that counts." Rosalie turned back to the stove. Her jaw was tight. Her hands kept moving, because her hands always kept moving, because if her hands stopped moving, the work didn't get done, and if the work didn't get done, she had no reason to be here at all. "Tell Mr. Pierce I'll see him after breakfast," she said. Calvin didn't leave immediately. He stayed for another moment, just long enough to make his presence felt, and then he walked out. Rosalie stood at the stove. Her biscuits were not heavy. She knew her biscuits were not heavy. She also knew that Harlan Pierce could claim they were. And there was no court she could take that claim to. She took a breath. She went back to work. Breakfast service ran from 6 to 7:30. 32 men came through in rotating shifts, depending on their morning assignments. And Rosalie moved between the stove and the serving counter and the coffee urn with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had run this operation so many times that her body knew the sequence without requiring instruction from her mind. It was during the second shift, at close to 7, that she heard him. Not his voice. Not yet. She heard his horse. She heard the particular sound of a horse ridden by someone who knew what they were doing, the controlled entry into the yard. The way the hoofbeats came in even and deliberate, rather than the sloppy, uneven rhythm of a poor rider, and without knowing why. She went to the small window above the work table and looked out. He was stepping down from a bay horse with a white blaze. Tall, dark hair going silver at the temples. The kind of build that came from actual physical work, rather than the cultivated broadness of men who wanted to look strong. He moved across the yard without urgency, without performance. And he had a quality she clocked immediately, and couldn't immediately name something in the way he looked at what he looked at. Like he was actually seeing it, like his attention was a thing he gave deliberately, rather than something that just fell on whatever was in front of him. He looked at the ranch yard. He looked at the bunkhouse. He looked at the main house. Then he looked at the kitchen. Not at the window she stepped back before that, but at the building itself. And even at this distance, even through warped glass, she had the strange, disorienting feeling of being noticed. She went back to the stove. She told herself it was nothing. 8 minutes later, he was standing in her kitchen doorway. "Excuse me, ma'am." She spun around. Her hand went to her chest. The spoon hit the work table edge and clattered onto the floor, and she bent to pick it up, and when she straightened, he was still there. Hat in hand, watching her with that same quality of actual attention. "I'm sorry," she said, the automatic reflex. "My fault," he said. "Shouldn't have come in without announcing myself." He didn't step further into the kitchen. He stayed in the doorway, which she registered the courtesy of not advancing into her space uninvited. "I'm looking for Harlan Pierce." Ranch hand outside said the main house. "But I smelled something coming from here, and he stopped. Looked at the stove. That's the best thing I've smelled in 4 days. Rosalie looked at the pot. Back at him. "Beef stew," she said. "Won't be on until noon. What's in it?" She blinked. People did not ask her what was in things. They ate what she made and occasionally commented on it in the third person from the other room. "Beef," she said. "Black pepper, little bit of molasses in the base." He nodded slowly, like he was actually hearing her answer and storing it. Then his eyes moved to the bowl on the work table. The cracked wooden bowl with its contents of cold gristle and a broken biscuit and a heel of bread. His expression didn't change dramatically. Nothing in his face performed reaction. But something shifted behind his eyes, quiet and fast. Like the change in a sky right before weather. "Is that your breakfast?" he asked. The question was so direct, so stripped of the polite avoidance, that everyone at Dawson Creek deployed around the subject of what Rosalie ate. That for a moment, she didn't know how to process it. "I eat after the men," she said. "The men are still eating." "Yes, and that's what you're eating while they eat." It was not a question. She answered it anyway. "It's enough." He looked at her. Not at the bowl. At her. "Who decided that?" he said. Something happened in Rosalie's chest, small and sharp, like a crack in something that had been sealed for a very long time. She pressed it down. "That's the arrangement," she said. "Whose arrangement?" "Mr. Pierce's." He was quiet for a moment. His eyes went to the serving dishes lined up on the counter full. Generous, the kind of portions that would leave men leaning back satisfied. Then back to her bowl. "What time did you start this morning?" he said. 4. "What time do you finish after supper dishes?" 9:30. He looked at the bowl one more time. Then he looked at her, and she had the disorienting experience of being looked at by someone who was seeing not just her face, and not just her size, and not just the cook at the stove, but something more than that, some complete picture that she herself had stopped trying to see when she looked in mirrors. "My name is Wyatt Mercer," he said. "I'm here for a cattle drive. Before I go to the main house, I want to ask you something." Rosalie waited. "What's your name?" 4 years. 4 years at Dawson Creek Ranch. And the question landed in her chest, like something falling from a height. "Rosalie," she said. "Rosalie Bennett." Wyatt Mercer nodded. Not the quick nod of acknowledgement as dismissal. A full, deliberate nod. Like her name was information he intended to keep. "Miss Rosalie," he said. When those men are done with their meal, I want you to take a full plate for yourself, from the front of the pot, not the scraps. Can you do that? She opened her mouth, closed it. That's not, she started. I know it isn't how things are done here, he said. Not unkindly, not with heat, with the flat, straightforward quality of someone stating a thing that is true. That's why I'm asking you to do it anyway. He put his hat back on. He walked out. Rosalie stood in the kitchen for a long moment, holding nothing, the stove crackling beside her, the sound of 30 men eating her food drifting through the wall. She looked at the cracked bowl. She looked at the pot. She picked up the ladle, and she stood there, hand on the ladle, fighting a war inside herself that should not have required fighting at all, the war between what she had been told she deserved and what some stubborn, buried part of her had never quite stopped believing she deserved, until Earl Dobbs came through the kitchen door to drop off his plate and stopped short at the sight of her expression. "You all right, cook?" he said. "Fine," she said. She set the ladle down. She could not take the plate. Not today. She didn't know that yet. She thought she'd failed at something small. She didn't know yet that the man she'd just met was already sitting across from Harlan Pierce, doing something that no one had done for her in 4 years. Fighting for her, where it counted. In Harlan's office, Wyatt Mercer declined the chair he was offered and stood. "I saw your kitchen on the way in," he said. Harlan Pierce blinked. He had prepared for a conversation about cattle routes and crew logistics and payment terms. He had not prepared for whatever this was. "The cook," Wyatt said. "She's been on since 4 this morning. The woman is compensated for. She's eating scraps from a broken bowl while the men eat off her stove." The silence that followed had a specific texture, the texture of a truth spoken in a room where everyone has been working hard not to speak it. Harlan's jaw shifted. Her dietary situation is a health arrangement. The woman has a condition that. She has a job, Wyatt said. And she does it better than anyone you could hire to replace her. And you know it, which is why you're managing her with hunger instead of paying her what she's worth. The color came up in Harlan's face fast. "Now you listen here. I need a cook for my crew on the drive," Wyatt said. He dropped his voice, not because he was backing down, but because he didn't need volume. He had something better than volume. He had leverage, and they both knew it. "Your cattle don't get to Billings without me. I don't ride without knowing my crew is fed by someone who can actually cook in trail conditions. And I won't work alongside an operation that runs like this." Harlan stared at him. "She eats full meals," Wyatt said, "same as the men. Same portions, same table, same time. She is an employee of this ranch and I will—" "Same table," Wyatt said. "Starting today at noon. Or I saddle up and you explain to your investors why your cattle didn't make it to the rail yard." Harlan Pierce was a man accustomed to being the one who applied pressure. Being on the receiving end of it produced in him an expression like a man biting into something sour and deciding whether to spit or swallow. He swallowed. "Fine," he said. The word was sandpaper in his mouth. "And her wages reflect her actual hours. That's the arrangement," Wyatt said. "Your word in front of your foreman today." Something cold moved behind Harlan's eyes. He gave his word. Wyatt noted the coldness. He noted that a man who agrees under pressure and feels nothing but calculation in the moment of agreement has not actually agreed to anything, he has simply recalibrated. He would need to watch this. At noon, Wyatt was already seated at the long table when the men came in. Rosalie came through with the serving dishes and set them down and turned to go back to the kitchen. The same rotation she ran every day, invisible, efficient, already moving toward the next task before the current one was done. "Miss Rosalie." She stopped. The room noticed. The room was suddenly listening in the specific way of a room full of men who have decided to pretend they're not listening. "Bring your plate out," Wyatt said. "You're eating here today." The silence was immediate and total. Calvin Rhodes at the far end of the table set his fork down. "Now hold on," Calvin said. His voice was the voice of a man defending a principle never examined but felt strongly about. "That ain't how what?" Wyatt said. The question sat there. Calvin's mouth opened and closed. "She cooked this meal," Wyatt said. Not loud, not angry, just present in the way that a stone wall is present, immovable, not through aggression, but through the simple fact of its existence. "She cooked every meal you've eaten at this table since you started at this ranch. She woke up at 4 this morning to do it. She is going to sit down and eat what she cooked. And that is how it's going to be." Nobody spoke. Rosalie stood in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hands and an expression that Wyatt could see clearly from where he sat, the expression of someone who has been holding their breath for so long. They've forgotten what breathing freely feels like, and who isn't sure yet whether it's safe to try. "Miss Rosalie," he said. "Quieter now, just for her. Bring your plate." She looked at him for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. Then she went back into the kitchen. The table waited. And she came out with a plate, a real plate, a full plate. Not scraps, not the broken bowl. And she sat down at the long table in the Dawson Creek Ranch dining room for the first time in 4 years. Nobody cheered. Nobody welcomed her. The men ate and talked around her the way men do when they're accommodating a reality they haven't fully processed yet. But she was there, at the table. Wyatt ate beside her and talked to her the way a person talks to another person about the sage in the stew, about where she'd learned to cook, about the biscuit recipe, and the way she read beef by color before the pan was even hot. And Rosalie answered him, carefully at first, one word where two might do, the habit of a woman who had trained herself small. Then more. Then with her hands moving, gesturing, the way people gesture when they're talking about something they know deeply and love genuinely. She talked about the older woman in Billings who'd taught her to feel dough rather than measure it. She talked about the sage patch she'd found behind the root cellar and kept growing for 3 years because nobody knew it was there and it was hers. She talked about the difference between a stew that's been cooked right and one that's been cooked long, which are not the same thing. She talked like someone who had forgotten, briefly, to be invisible. Wyatt watched her and thought that this exact thing, this woman with her hands moving and her eyes lit from the inside and her voice carrying something that wasn't apology, was who Rosalie Bennett actually was. He thought about how much had been done to put that person away. Calvin Rhodes was the last man out of the dining room at noon. He stopped beside Rosalie's chair on his way past. He didn't look at her directly. He spoke toward the middle distance, quiet enough that the words were only for her. "Don't go getting comfortable," he said. "Mercer's valuable. Pierce wants him. Man leaves. This goes back to how it was. You know it and I know it." Rosalie went still. She didn't answer. Calvin walked out. Rosalie sat at the table she'd just eaten at for the first time, in the silence left by 30 men who had filed out without looking back. And she turned the words over in her mind the way you turn something over when you're checking to see if it's as sharp as it looks. It was. She found Wyatt on the porch afterward, checking the cinch on his horse's saddle. And she stood at the top of the porch steps and waited until he looked up. "Calvin told me not to get comfortable," she said. Wyatt straightened, looked at her. "What did you say back?" "Nothing." He nodded slowly. "He's not wrong," Rosalie said. "Things go back." "Maybe," Wyatt said. Not maybe. There was no bitterness in it. Just the flat, worn truth of a woman who had stopped dressing hard facts up in better clothes. "It's how things work here. You know it." Wyatt came up the porch steps and stood level with her. And she had to look up at him slightly, and she didn't flinch from it, which he registered. "You've been keeping your head down 4 years," he said. "Yes, and things got better." She said nothing. "Here's what I know," Wyatt said. "Calvin's going to do what Calvin does. Pierce is going to do what Pierce does. I can't change those men. But there's something you can do that none of them can take from you. No matter what they do when I'm gone." She was watching him carefully. Not with hope, exactly. With the guarded attention of someone who has been given hope before and learned what the aftermath feels like. "What's that?" she said. "Know your own worth," he said. "Not because I told you. Not because you sat at a table today. But because you've known it all along and you've been letting other people talk you out of it for 4 years." He held her gaze. "Stop letting them." Rosalie looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face too complex and too fast to name. But somewhere in it was the expression of a woman recognizing the outline of something she had lost so long ago she'd stopped trying to find it. "That's easier to say than to do," she said. "Most true things are," Wyatt said. She looked out at the ranch yard. The afternoon heat was building, pressing down on everything, and somewhere out on the range she could hear cattle moving, and men calling to each other. The ordinary sounds of the place that had swallowed 4 years of her life. "Why do you care?" She's not accusatory, genuinely asking. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "Because somebody should have." "Sooner," he said. Rosalie looked at him. She looked away. She went back inside to start supper. Her hands were steadier than they'd been in the morning. Her jaw was set differently, not hard, not braced, but decided, like a woman who has just remembered something important and is keeping it close, turning it over, not ready yet to name it, but unwilling to put it down again. In the kitchen alone, she looked at the cabinet door, at the marks she'd been making for 4 years. She took the pencil from the shelf. She did not make a mark. Instead, she wrote 3 words beside the column of days small and private, written in the back corner, where only she would ever see them. Not to done. She put the pencil down. She started supper. And somewhere in the back of her mind, quiet and just beginning, something that had been packed down under 4 years of "yes, sir," and that's the arrangement, and it's enough started to push back up toward the surface, like a plant that's been covered with dirt, but never actually killed. She didn't know yet how hard the fight ahead would be. She didn't know yet what Calvin Rhodes was already planning. She didn't know yet that by the time the kitchen went dark that night, someone would have gone through her supply stores and moved things she needed for morning, not stolen. Just moved, just enough to cost her time and create confusion and give Pierce a reason to criticize her work. She didn't know any of that yet, but she went to bed that night with a full stomach and 3 words in pencil on the inside of a cabinet door. And for the first time in 4 years, that felt like something. She found it the next morning at 4:15. The sage was gone. Not missing, not misplaced. Gone the bundle she'd hung to dry above the back shelf. The one she'd cut from her private patch behind the root cellar. The one that had been aging 3 weeks and was exactly right for today's stew. Gone. The salt crock had been moved to the wrong shelf. The flour sack had been pushed to the back, and a full 10 pounds of cornmeal stacked in front of it, so that when she reached for flour in the dark, her hand hit cornmeal, and she knocked the whole stack, and caught it only by grabbing shelf edge hard enough to split the skin on her palm. She stood in the dark kitchen with a bleeding hand and a missing ingredient, and 27 men coming through that door in less than 2 hours. She did not cry. She pressed her hand against her apron, held it there and thought. Then she went to work. She used dried rosemary from the bottom of the spice box, older, less fragrant but workable. She reorganized the shelves in 20 minutes flat, moving by feel and memory because she'd stood in this kitchen long enough that she could navigate it blind. She got the bread started late, which meant it would come out at 6:40 instead of 6. Which meant the first shift would eat biscuits while they waited. Which meant she needed twice the biscuits she'd planned. She made twice the biscuits. By the time the first man came through the door at 6:15, there was hot coffee, fresh biscuits, and a stew on the stove that smelled like everything was fine. Because she had decided everything was going to be fine. Calvin Rhodes came through in the second shift. He looked at the table. He looked at the food. He looked at her with a slow, assessing look that was searching for something, Some sign that the disruption had rattled her. Some crack in her composure he could press on, and he found nothing. Because she was behind the serving counter and her bleeding hand was wrapped in a clean cloth, and she had arranged herself so that nothing on her face gave him what he was looking for. "Stew smells different," Calvin said. "Rosemary instead of sage," Rosalie said. "Sage wasn't where I left it." Calvin held her gaze for just one beat longer than was natural. Then he sat down. He didn't admit to anything. He didn't need to. They both understood the exchange. Completely, she knew what he'd done. He knew she knew, and they both understood that this knowledge existed in a space where she had no recourse, and he had no consequence. That was the whole point. Wyatt came in during the second shift and sat across from Earl Dobbs. And Rosalie brought coffee, and he looked at her hand. When she set the cup down the cloth wrap, the slight stiffness in her fingers, and his eyes moved from her hand to her face. She looked back at him steadily. He did not ask about the hand in front of the table. He waited. After the shift cleared out, he came to the kitchen door. "What happened to your hand?" he said. "Shelf accident," she said. "I'm fine, Rosalie." She kept washing the dishes. "Shelf was reorganized overnight," she said. "Reached for flour in the dark. Caught the edge wrong. It's a small cut." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "Your sage is gone," he said. It wasn't a guess. She didn't answer. He came into the kitchen and stood at the work table. She kept washing. "Has this happened before?" he said. She thought about the question. She thought about all the small ways the job had been made harder. Over 4 years, the things that disappeared. The complaints that materialized from nowhere. The criticism that arrived precisely when her confidence was highest. She had chalked most of it to carelessness or bad luck or her own oversight. Standing here now, with this morning's evidence still wrapped around her palm. She was recalibrating. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe yes," Wyatt said. Not a question. She put the dish down, turned to face him. "What do you want me to say?" she said. "That Calvin did it? That Pierce authorized it? I can't prove that. And even if I could." "I reported to who, Pierce?" She looked at him directly. "You've been here 2 days, Wyatt. You don't know how this ranch works." "I know how men like Calvin work," he said. "Then you know there's nothing I can do about it right now." "There is one thing," he said. She waited. "Write it down," he said. "Every time something goes wrong. What was missing? What was moved? What was said to you? And who said it? Date and time. Everything." She looked at him. "For what purpose?" she said. "Who am I going to show it to?" "I don't know yet," he said. But a woman with records is harder to dismiss than a woman with complaints. Records are real. Records are a thing you can put on a table. He held her gaze. "Will you do it?" Rosalie looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the cabinet door, about the 3 words she'd written last night. "Not to done. I'll need a proper notebook," she said. "I'll get you one," Wyatt said. He came back at noon with a small leather-bound notebook from his saddlebag worn, but with blank pages in the back, the kind a man carries for route maps and weather notes. He set it on the kitchen work table without ceremony. She picked it up. She opened it to the first blank page. At the top, she wrote, "July 12, 1871. Sage removed from drying rack. Salt crock blocked by cornmeal. Hand cut on shelf edge during pre-dawn prep. No witnesses." She looked at what she'd written for a moment. Then she closed the notebook and put it in her apron pocket, against her hip, where it would stay. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that Calvin Rhodes had not acted alone that night. Harlan Pierce had authorized it, not with words, not with a direct order that could be recalled. Harlan was too careful for direct orders. He had simply said, after Wyatt had left his office the previous afternoon, to his foreman, with his eyes on the window and his voice perfectly measured, "The cook is getting ideas above her station. I trust you know how to manage that." Calvin knew exactly how to manage that. What Calvin did not account for was Wyatt Mercer still being on the property. And what Harlan did not account for was Rosalie Bennett picking up a notebook. The days that followed had a particular rhythm surface calm, with pressure underneath. Like a river that looks smooth from the bank, but is moving fast beneath the surface. Wyatt was preparing the crew for the drive, working long days evaluating horses and route maps and supply lists. And Rosalie was in the kitchen doing what she always did. But differently now. Differently in ways that were small and internal and invisible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. She ate at the table every noon. Nobody welcomed her. But nobody stopped her either, because Wyatt was there. And Calvin was watching Wyatt the way a man watches something he intends to move around when it's no longer blocking his way. On the fourth day after Wyatt's arrival, a ranch hand named Tommy Greer dropped his tin cup on the way past Rosalie at the serving counter and said, without looking at her, loud enough for the nearby men to hear, "Careful you don't block the whole doorway there, cook." The table laughed. Not all of them. Rosalie set the coffee pot down. She looked at Tommy Greer. She said very clearly, in a voice that carried, "I didn't block anything. Tommy, you dropped your cup. Pick it up." The table went quiet. Tommy Greer looked at her. His face cycled through surprise. Then irritation. Then a particular kind of blankness that men get when something has happened that doesn't match their expectations, and they haven't decided yet how to respond. He picked up the cup. He sat down. He didn't say anything else. Rosalie picked up the coffee pot and finished the round. Her hand was shaking slightly when she got back to the kitchen. She gripped the handle of the pot until it stopped. That was new. Not the shaking, she'd felt that before. After confrontations she had never allowed to become confrontations. What was new was what had come before the shaking. What was new was the moment she'd decided to speak. She took out the notebook that evening, July 15, 1871. Tommy Greer. Doorway comment. Men laughed. I answered him. He picked up the cup. First time I have spoken back in approximately 16 months. She looked at that last sentence. She closed the notebook. Wyatt found her on the back step again that evening. Same cup of coffee, same position, looking at the same stretch of range going dark under the stars. He sat on the step below her the way he had before, facing the yard. Heard about this afternoon, he said. News travels fast in a small ranch, she said. It does. He was quiet for a moment. How'd it feel? Rosalie thought about the question seriously. The way it deserved to be thought about. Terrifying, she said. And then good. Both at once. Wyatt nodded. That's usually how it feels the first time. He's going to hold it against me, she said. Tommy Greer's going to hold it against you for about 2 days, Wyatt said. And then something else will happen, and he'll forget about it. Men like Tommy Greer don't hold on to things. They just throw them and move on. Calvin's different, she said. Calvin's different, he agreed. She looked out at the range. What do you know about Harlan Pierce? She said. Before you came here, what had you heard about this ranch? Wyatt was quiet for a moment longer than felt like a thinking pause. It felt more like a deciding pause, deciding how much to say. I'd heard he runs a tight operation, he said. I'd heard he keeps wages low and works people hard. What else? He looked at her sideways. What makes you think there's something else? He said. Because you looked like a man deciding what to leave out, she said. I've been watching people's faces for 4 years. I got good at it. Wyatt was quiet, then he said. I heard he had a cook before you, woman named May Sutton. Left after 6 months. What happened to her? She said. I don't know exactly, Wyatt said. I heard she left in a hurry. Heard she had something to do with a supply discrepancy Pierce claimed she was taking from the stores. She denied it. She had no proof either way, so she left. Rosalie heard that. She heard all of it, a supply discrepancy, items missing or moved. A woman with no proof. She thought about her sage. She thought about her flour. She thought about every small thing over 4 years that she had written off as her own mistake. He's been doing this since before me, she said. It wasn't a question. Wyatt looked at her. That's what I think, he said carefully. But I don't have proof of that either. Rosalie pulled the notebook from her apron pocket and held it against her chest. She wasn't cold. The summer night was warm, but she held it like it was something that needed protecting. Then I need more proof than one notebook, she said. You do, Wyatt said. You also need, he stopped. What? She said. You need at least one person on this ranch who will corroborate what they've seen. Someone who will stand up and say it out loud. Rosalie thought about the 32 men who ate her food every day. She thought about how many of them had ever said anything when Calvin made a comment, or when Tommy Greer laughed, or when Pierce stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her like she was a problem with legs. She thought about Earl Dobbs, who said her biscuits were the best in the territory every single morning, and never once looked toward the kitchen when he said it. There's nobody like that here, she said. Not yet, Wyatt said. She looked at him. You're leaving in 4 days, she said. 5, he said. Maybe 6. Drive leaves when the crew is ready. He turned to look at her fully. A lot can change in 5 days, Rosalie. She looked back at him. In the dim light of a Montana summer night, with the stars coming out one by one and the range going quiet around them, she looked at this man who had ridden in 5 days ago and rearranged the entire architecture of how she thought about her own situation. And she felt something complicated and alarming and genuine moving through her chest. She recognized it. She did not say what she recognized it as. I'm not going to fall apart when you leave, she said. I want you to know that. I know that, he said. I'm just telling you, so it said. Appreciate it, he said. No teasing in it. No deflection. He just received it straight. The way he received most things. She looked away. Good night. Wyatt, she said. Good night, Miss Rosalie. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time in the dark, the notebook flat in front of her, and she thought about May Sutton, who had left in a hurry and had no proof. She thought about herself. 4 years later, with a notebook against her ribs and 5 days of a different kind of life to figure out how to hold on to. She opened the notebook. She wrote, There was a cook before me. Her name was May Sutton. She left after 6 months. Pierce accused her of theft from the supply stores. She had no proof to defend herself. She wrote, I will not be May Sutton. She underlined it. She closed the notebook. The following morning, something changed at the table. It happened quietly. The way significant things sometimes happen, not with announcement, but with the small, unmistakable shift of a tide turning. Rosalie came out with the serving dishes at 6, and when she turned to go back to the kitchen, Earl Dobbs said, without looking up from his plate, Thank you, ma'am. 2 words. She stopped walking. She turned back. Earl Dobbs was looking at his biscuit with the studied attention of a man who has said something he means but is not accustomed to saying and would prefer not to make a ceremony of. You're welcome, Earl, she said. She went back to the kitchen. Her chest was doing something complicated. She stood at the stove and breathed for a moment and told herself it was just 2 words and it didn't change anything significant. But it did, because the table had heard it, and the next morning, when she brought coffee to the near end, a young ranch hand named Daniel Hale, 19 years old, new to the ranch, with a face that hadn't finished deciding what it was going to look like, said, also without looking up, Morning, ma'am. 2 more words. Small and enormous simultaneously, Calvin noticed. He had the specific attention of a man whose control depends on isolation, who understands that if the person he's marginalizing begins to build connections, even small ones, the entire architecture of her powerlessness begins to shift. He watched Earl Dobbs say thank you on the 3rd morning. He watched Daniel Hale hold the serving counter door open when Rosalie came through with a loaded dish. At supper that night, Calvin sat across from Earl Dobbs and said, casually in the voice of a man making conversation, "Hear you been getting friendly with the cook." Earl looked up. "Just being polite," Earl said. "Ranch hands that get too friendly with the cook tend to find themselves on the worst trail assignments," Calvin said. Still casual. Still light. The way a threat sounds when it's wrapped in the tone of an observation. Earl looked at his plate. He didn't say anything else. The next morning, Earl Dobbs did not say thank you. Rosalie noticed. She said nothing. She wrote it down. July 18, 1871. Earl Dobbs stopped speaking to me after conversation with Calvin Rhodes at supper. Daniel Hale has not made eye contact since yesterday. Calvin spoke to them both in the yard this morning, saw through the kitchen window. Brief exchange. Both men looked at the ground. She put the notebook away. She stood at the stove. She thought, he is willing to threaten the men around me to keep me alone. That means he is worried about me not being alone. That means the two words Earl Dobbs said mattered more than they seemed. She thought, if one thank you made Calvin nervous enough to respond, then I am building something even when I can't feel it. She kept building. She started paying closer attention to what she heard through the walls. She heard things she wasn't meant to hear, things that circled back to her, like rumors do in small, contained operations where sound travels and people forget who's listening. She heard Calvin telling a group of men that Pierce was planning to bring in a second cook, come fall someone more suitable, and that Rosalie's position was under evaluation. She heard Pierce, through the thin wall between kitchen and study, say to someone she couldn't identify, "She's getting difficult." The Mercer situation gave her ideas. She heard the word ideas pronounced with the same tone a person uses for disease. She wrote all of it down. And then, on the 6th day of Wyatt's presence at Dawson Creek, the thing happened that Rosalie had not anticipated. She was in the kitchen at 3 in the afternoon, alone, working through prep for the evening meal, when the back door, not the dining room door, the outside door, the one that opened onto the alley between the kitchen and the feed barn, opened. A woman she had never seen before stepped inside. She was older, 50. Perhaps, with gray-streaked hair pinned tight and the particular posture of someone who had spent decades holding themselves very straight. She looked at Rosalie the way a woman looks at another woman when she is assessing something other than appearance. "You're the cook," the woman said. "I am," Rosalie said. She did not recognize her. "Can I help you?" "My name is Clara Whitman," the woman said. "I own a restaurant on the East Road, coming into town. My cook left 2 weeks ago. I've been asking around." Rosalie set down her knife. "Asking around for what?" she said. "For a cook worth hiring," Clara said. "I heard about you from a man named Wyatt Mercer. He came by yesterday." Rosalie went very still. "He came to your restaurant," she said. "He came to my restaurant," Clara confirmed. "Said he'd eaten a beef stew with sage and molasses that was better than anything he'd had in Montana Territory. And that the woman who made it was working somewhere that didn't deserve her." Clara looked at her steadily. "He said if I was serious about building something worth traveling to, I should come talk to you." Rosalie stood in some kitchen and felt something she hadn't felt in 4 years. Not hope, exactly. Something before hope. Something earlier in the sequence. The moment before you dare to hope, when you can feel hope becoming possible and you're terrified of it, because possible is not the same as real, and you know what it costs to want something real and have it taken away. "I can't just leave," she said. "No," Clara said, "I know that. I'm not asking you to leave today. I'm asking if you want to talk." Rosalie looked at this woman in her kitchen. She thought about May Sutton. She thought about 4 years of marks on the inside of a cabinet door. She thought about her notebook, heavy in her apron pocket. "Sit down," Rosalie said. "I'll make." Clara sat. They talked for 40 minutes, and when Clara left through the back door the way she'd come in. Rosalie stood in the kitchen alone and pressed both hands flat on the work table and looked at them, her hands. Cracked and calloused and flour-dusted and strong, and something in her chest that had been tied down for 4 years strained against whatever was holding it. Hard enough that she felt it physically. She picked up the notebook. She wrote Clara Whitman, East Road Restaurant. Wyatt went to her first. He went before I even knew this was possible. He did that quietly, without asking for credit. She wrote, someone moved before I asked them to. She underlined it. She looked at the words. She thought, that's what it looks like when someone actually sees you. Not when they tell you they see you. When they act on what they see before you even know there's something to act on. And for the first time in a very long time, something that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with the future moved through Rosalie Bennett's chest and kept going. All the way out to the edges of her, all the way to her fingertips. Warm and alarming and unmistakable. She did not name it. But she did not push it back down. That evening she made supper with a different quality to her movements, not faster. Not more productive, but more deliberate. Like a woman who has just remembered where she's going. Wyatt came through the kitchen door an hour before supper service, which he had never done before. He stopped inside the doorway and looked at her. And she looked back at him, and she could see from his expression that he knew Clara had come. You went to her first, she said. I did, he said. Before you told me. Yes, she looked at him. Why? He came to the work table. He stood across from her. He looked at her with that same quality he'd had from the first morning, the quality of actual seeing. Because I needed to know there was something real to tell you about, he said. Not a possibility. A real thing, a real woman, a real place. Something I could put in your hand instead of just pointing at the horizon and saying, go that way. He paused. You've been given enough empty direction. I didn't want to be another person doing that. Rosalie looked at him. Her jaw worked once. That was thoughtful of you, she said. Her voice was steady. Everything beneath it was not. Clara's a good woman, he said. Her restaurant's small. It would be hard work starting over. I know hard work, Rosalie said. I know you do, he said. He left to get cleaned up for supper. Rosalie stood at the stove. She thought about what he had said. I needed to know there was something real to tell you about. She thought about the quality of care that went into that, the specific, considered care of someone who had looked at who she was and what she'd been through, and asked himself what she actually needed, rather than what would make him feel useful. She thought, this man has been at this ranch for 6 days, and he has done more for the actual practical architecture of my life than anyone in 4 years. She thought, what does a woman do with that? She stirred the pot. She did not have an answer yet, but supper that night was the best meal she had made at Dawson Creek Ranch in 4 years. Not because she was performing for anyone, because she was cooking for herself. Finally, with her full attention, her full skill, her full understanding of what the food could be when she brought everything she had to it, instead of saving herself for a life that was never going to get better on its own. The men ate and were, for once, genuinely silenced by the food. Even Calvin Rhodes, at the end of the table, was quiet for the first half of the meal. It was Earl Dobbs who said it first. He set his fork down, looked at the table, and said, loud, deliberate, with the conviction of a man settling a debt, best meal I've eaten in 4 years at this ranch. And that's the truth. The table was quiet. Then Daniel Hale said, yes, sir. And 2 more men nodded. Calvin looked at the end of the table. He said nothing, but his jaw was tight and his eyes, when they moved to Rosalie at the serving counter, had something in them that was no longer casual. Rosalie met his look. She held it, for exactly as long as it took to make clear that she was not looking away first. Then she picked up the empty serving dish and walked back into the kitchen. Her hands were not shaking. That was new. That was everything. Wyatt Mercer left on a Thursday morning, He didn't make a production of it. That wasn't his way. He came to the kitchen door at 5:45. Before the first shift, while Rosalie was working through the bread. And he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and his saddlebags over his shoulder, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her every morning, for 8 days directly. With full attention, like she was someone worth looking at. "Drive leaves in an hour," he said. "I know," she said. She did not stop working. If she stopped working, she would have to stand still with the feeling. And she was not ready for that yet. "You have the notebook," he said. "I have the notebook. You have Clara's address, I have it." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him in the doorway, that steady, particular presence that she had already, in 8 days, built her mornings around without meaning to. "Rosalie," he said. She turned around. He was looking at her with something in his face she hadn't seen there before, something that had moved past the practical, past the protective, into territory that neither of them had named, and both of them had been carefully navigating around for 8 days. "You know what you're worth," he said. "You know it now. Don't let them talk you out of it." She looked at him. She thought about 8 days. She thought about the cracked wooden bowl, the notebook, Clara Whitman sitting at her kitchen table, Earl Dobbs saying best meal in 4 years, with the conviction of a man paying a debt. She thought about the backstep and the stars and the word 4 years and the way Wyatt Mercer had received it without flinching. "I'll try," she said. "Don't try," he said. "No." He put his hat on. He walked out. She listened to his boots cross the yard. She listened to the sound of a horse being brought up. She listened to voices his crew, organizing, the ordinary sounds of men preparing to move. She stood at the work table with her hands in bread dough, and she listened until the sounds faded south toward the trail road. And then there was just the kitchen, and the fire, and the bread and her. She pulled the dough. She folded it. She pressed it flat. She did not fall apart, but it was close. The changes started the same afternoon. Harland Pierce came to the kitchen at 2 o'clock, which he had not done in 3 weeks. He stood in the doorway, the same doorway Wyatt had stood in, which Rosalie noted and filed, and he looked at her with the assessing eyes of a man reclaiming territory. "Settling back in," he said. "I never left," Rosalie said. "No," he said. "You didn't." He looked around the kitchen slowly. "Things are going to return to normal now. You understand that?" She held his gaze. "What things specifically, Mr. Pierce?" she said. His eyes sharpened. The directness surprised him. She could see it, the small recalibration, the slight stiffening, the adjustment of a man who had expected her to look down and found her looking straight back. "Meal arrangements," he said. "Work expectations. The general order of how this kitchen operates." "You agreed to full meals," she said. "Full wages. You said it in front of Calvin. I agreed to certain accommodations for the duration of Mercer's business with this ranch," Harland said. His voice had the measured quality of a man who had prepared this sentence in advance. "That business is concluded." Rosalie set the dish she was holding down. Very carefully. "I see. Good," Harland said. "I'm glad we understand each other." He left. Rosalie stood in the kitchen. She breathed in. She breathed out. She pulled the notebook from her apron pocket and wrote, "July 24, 1871. Harland Pierce. Visited kitchen at 2 p.m. Stated meal and wage agreements made in Wyatt Mercer's presence are no longer operative. Direct quote, accommodations for the distribution of Mercer's business." She wrote, He was specific. He was calm. He had prepared what to say. This was not impulsive. This was planned before Mercer left the property. She underlined the last sentence twice. Then she put the notebook away and started on supper, because supper still needed making regardless of what Harland Pierce had decided about the rest of her life. That night, for the first time in 8 days, she ate in the kitchen. Not from the cracked bowl. She had thrown that away on the 3rd day of Wyatt's presence. Quietly, without ceremony, dropping it in the waste pile, while nobody was watching. She used a proper plate, but she ate alone, standing at the counter, listening to the men through the wall, and the difference between tonight and 3 weeks ago was that tonight she knew exactly what was being taken from her. That knowledge was not comfortable, but it was real. And she had decided that real was what she was going to work with. Calvin came for the notebook 3 days later. She didn't know that's what he was after. At first, he came into the kitchen while she was outside at the well, bringing up the morning water, and when she came back through the door, she found him at the work table. Looking through the shelf, she kept her personal items on the small shelf beside the back window, where she kept her pen, her spare apron strings, the letter from her mother's friend in Billings that had come the previous winter, and that she kept because it was one of the only pieces of paper she had that was addressed to her by name. Calvin straightened when she came in. He had the look of a man caught doing something he would describe as something else. "Can I help you with something?" Rosalie said. "Looking for the supply ledger," he said. "Pierce wants the week's tallies. The supply ledger is in the front cabinet," Rosalie said. "Where it always is. Where you've known it is for 3 years." Calvin looked at her. She looked back at him. He went to the front cabinet. He took the ledger he left. Rosalie went to her shelf. The pen was in the wrong position. Slightly, but wrong. She kept it parallel to the shelf edge, and it was now at an angle. The letter had been moved, and her apron strings, which she folded in a specific way, were folded differently. He had been thorough, and he had been quick, and he had not found what he was looking for, because the notebook was in her apron pocket. It was always in her apron pocket. She stood at the shelf and pressed her hand against her pocket, felt the notebook's edge against her palm, and thought, "He knows about the notebook. Pierce told him about the notebook." Or he guessed. She thought, if they want the notebook matters. She thought, good. She went to work. What came next came fast, the way bad weather comes when you've been watching the wrong part of the sky. On the 5th day after Wyatt's departure, she found that 30 pounds of flour were logged in the supply ledger as received, but were not in the storeroom. She checked twice. She counted every sack. The flour was not there. She wrote it down. On the 7th day, Harlan Pierce called her into his office and told her, with the careful, bureaucratic precision of a man who had thought about this sentence for a week, that 3 months of her wages had been docked for supply losses attributable to kitchen mismanagement. She stood in front of his desk. She kept her face still. "What supply losses?" she said. 30 pounds of flour, Harlan said. "Documented in the ledger as received but not present in inventory. The discrepancy falls under your responsibility." "I didn't receive that flour," Rosalie said. "It was logged before it reached my storeroom. The ledger says otherwise." "Then the ledger is wrong." Harlan looked at her with the expression of a man who has just watched someone walk into the exact trap he laid. "Are you calling my record-keeping into question?" "I'm calling a specific entry into question," Rosalie said. "One entry on one date for a delivery I never signed for." "Cooks don't sign for deliveries," Harlan said. "The foreman signs for deliveries." "Then ask your foreman where the flour went," she said. The silence that followed was the most dangerous silence she had stood in since coming to Dawson Creek Ranch. It was the silence of a man who had just realized the woman across the desk from him was not the woman he'd been managing for 4 years. Something had shifted in her, something structural. Something that went all the way down, and he was recalibrating in real time. And she could see him doing it, and she did not look away. "Your wages for August will reflect the adjustment," Harlan said. "Finally. That's final. I'll need that in writing," Rosalie said. His eyes went flat. "In writing," she said. "The amount docked, the reason, the date. In writing. With your signature." She could see him thinking. She could see him running the calculation. Was this woman going to cause a problem? Was she actually capable of causing a problem? What did she actually have and what could she do with it, and was it worth the confrontation to push back now? She watched him decide she was bluffing. "I'll have Calvin noted in the ranch records," he said. "I want my own copy," she said. "My own copy," she said. Steady, not loud, not angry, just present in the way a stone wall is present. Immovable through weight rather than aggression. "Or I walk to town today and I speak to Harold Garrett." Harlan Pierce went very still. Harold Garrett was the county land commissioner, which was not exactly law enforcement, but was the closest thing to official authority within 40 miles of Dawson Creek Ranch. And his name in this office had the effect of a cold wind through a door left open. "You have no business with Harold Garrett," Harlan said. "Not yet," Rosalie said. "That's what I'm telling you." Another silence. Harlan picked up his pen. He wrote 4 lines on a slip of paper. He signed it. He held it out. She took it. She looked at it. She folded it and put it in her pocket, against the notebook. "Is there anything else, Mr. Pierce?" she said. There was nothing else. She walked out of his office and across the yard and into the kitchen, and she stood at the work table, and her hands were shaking badly now. Badly enough that she gripped the table edge with both hands and held on and breathed through it. She had just done something that could not be undone. She had named Harold Garrett in Harlan Pierce's office. She had made a threat that was real only if she was willing to follow it. She didn't know yet if she was. She pulled out the notebook. She wrote everything, every word, in sequence, the way she'd heard it and said it. She wrote down the amount docked, the date, the exact phrasing Pierce had used. She wrote down his face when she said Garrett's name. She folded the signed slip inside the notebook's back cover. She breathed. She thought, "Wyatt, where are you?" She thought. "It doesn't matter where he is. He's not here, I am. I have to be enough." She started supper. Earl Dobbs found her at the well that evening. He came up when nobody else was around. She had the specific sense that he had been waiting for this, and he stood to one side and spoke in the direction of the middle distance. The way he had learned to speak when he didn't want it to look like he was speaking. "Heard what happened in the office," he said. "News travels," she said. "Ranch this size, yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "You said Garrett's name." "I did. Pierce is going to move against you," Earl said. "You know that." "I know. He moved against May Sutton. He'll move against you harder because you pushed back." Earl looked at his boots. "I should have said something before now. About May. About a lot of things." Rosalie looked at him. This was the man who said best biscuits in the territory every morning and never looked toward the kitchen. This was the man who had said thank you once and been warned by Calvin and gone quiet. This was the man she had written off as someone who saw everything and would say nothing. "Why are you saying it now?" she said. Earl looked up. "Because what you did in that office today," he said, "was the bravest thing I've seen on this ranch. And I've been on this ranch 6 years. He swallowed. If you go to Garrett, if you go with what you've got, I'll back you up. What I've seen. What May told me before she left." He looked at her steadily. "I'll say it out loud." Rosalie stood at the well. The bucket was in her hand. She was looking at Earl Dobbs, who had spent 6 years being the man who said best biscuits in the territory and never once looked toward the kitchen. And she was watching him decide, right now, in front of her, to be a different man. "May talked to you before she left," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "What did she tell you?" Earl told her. It took 7 minutes. Rosalie listened to all of it and did not interrupt once. When he finished, she stood very still for a moment. Then she said, "I need you to write that down. What May told you. And what you saw yourself. Dated." Earl nodded. "I can do that tonight," she said. "Before you change your mind." He nodded again. Tonight. She went back to the kitchen. She was halfway through setting up the supper prep when Daniel Hale came through the back door, the young one. 19 years old, with the face that hadn't finished deciding, and he stopped inside the door and looked at her with the expression of someone who has prepared what they're going to say, and is now suddenly unsure whether they should say it. "I heard you and Earl," he said, "at the well." She looked at him. "I wasn't trying to listen," he said. "I was coming to get water." He paused. "I've been here 8 months. I've seen things. I don't know if it matters." "What things?" she said. "I saw Calvin Rhodes move the flour sacks," Daniel said. "The 30 pounds. He moved them to the Hendersons' barn on the east property. I saw him do it from the loft. I didn't know what it meant then." Rosalie went very still. "You saw that?" "Yes, ma'am. Week before last." Tuesday morning. She thought about the supply ledger. She thought about the docked wages. She thought about Harlan Pierce signing that slip of paper with the careful certainty of a man who believed he had the only evidence that mattered. He didn't. "Can you write that down?" she said. "Yes." "Ma'am, will you write it down?" Daniel looked at her for a moment. "He'll fire me," he said. "Maybe," she said, "probably." "This goes the way I think it goes." "Then why would it?" "Because it's the truth," Rosalie said. "And because a woman before me lost her job and her reputation and had to leave in the middle of the night with nothing because there was nobody who would say what they saw." She looked at him. "You don't have to. I'm not going to tell you it's without cost. It has a cost, but you can pay it or not. That's yours." Daniel Hale stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment. He was 19 years old. He nodded. "I'll write it down," he said. He left. Rosalie stood in the kitchen alone and thought. Two people in one day, after 8 days of nothing. That's what one moment of courage in a man's office produced. 2 people willing to say what they saw, she thought. Wyatt would say that's how it works, that you don't know what moves when you push. You just push and find out. She pushed the thought of Wyatt away from the center of her attention because she needed her center clear. She started supper. She was 30 minutes into it when she smelled the smoke. At first she thought it was the stove the wood sometimes caught wrong and sent smoke back before the flue opened fully. And she moved automatically to check the damper, and the damper was fine. And the smoke was not coming from the stove. It was coming from the back wall. She was out the back door in 5 seconds. The woodpile against the outside wall of the kitchen was on fire. Not fully, not yet, but the dry summer grass between the pile and the wall had caught, and the wallboards were beginning to smoke at the base, and the fire was moving with the certainty of something that had been started deliberately, rather than the hesitance of something accidental. She screamed for help. She grabbed the water bucket from the well hook. She ran. She got 2 buckets on it before Earl Dobbs came around the corner at a run. And then Daniel, and then 3 more men from the yard. And between them they got it out in 20 minutes, the woodpile destroyed. A section of the outside wall charred black, the grass around it scorched to dirt. But the kitchen itself standing, barely. Rosalie stood in the yard and looked at the black wall. She was breathing hard. Her hands were burned, not badly, but burned, the palms pink and raw from the bucket handles and the heat of the water splashing back. Her dress was soaked. Her hair had come down and was sticking to the side of her face. Calvin Rhodes arrived last, from the direction of the bunkhouse, with the specific unhurried pace of a man who has been in the bunkhouse long enough to establish that that's where he was. He looked at the charred wall. He looked at Rosalie. "Accident," he said. It wasn't a question. Rosalie looked at him. She looked at his hands. She looked at the slight discoloration at the cuff of his left sleeve, a grayish mark. The kind a cuff gets when it passes too close to a flame and doesn't quite catch. She looked at his face. He held her gaze without flinching. The gaze of a man daring her to say what she knew. She said nothing. Earl Dobbs, standing 2 feet to her left, made a sound, not a word, just a sound, something between a breath and a word that got stopped before it formed. She felt him register the cuff. She felt him make the same calculation she was making. She put her burned hand against her apron. She looked away from Calvin. Accident. Uninflected. Calvin nodded once. He went back to the bunkhouse. Rosalie waited until he was gone. Then, she said, very quietly to Earl, "Did you see where he came from?" "South side of the building," Earl said. Equally quiet. "I saw him come around the south corner." "The woodpile's on the south side," she nodded. She went to the notebook. That strode. July 31, 1871. Fire south wall, kitchen exterior. Woodpile and grass ignition. Kitchen wall damaged but standing. Calvin Rhodes arrived from south side of building. Later claimed bunkhouse. Cuff discoloration left sleeve. Earl Dobbs confirms south side approach. Fire contained by well water. My hands burned. She looked at the last two words. She wrote, "He meant to break me with this. He meant for me to stand in the ashes and decide I was finished." She wrote, "I am not finished." She closed the notebook. She went back into the kitchen. Her hands hurt. Her back hurt. The charred smell was coming through the back wall, and probably would for days. There were 45 minutes left before supper service, and she had lost 30 minutes to the fire. She moved faster. She got supper on the table at the right time. She was at the serving counter when Harlan Pierce came into the dining room, unusual. He rarely ate with the men and sat at the head of the table. He looked at the food. He looked at her. He looked at her hands. His expression was, she thought, almost satisfied. Almost. There was something beneath the satisfaction that wasn't satisfaction. Something that looked like it was recalibrating again. She served his plate without a word. She went back to the kitchen. She was washing the first load of dishes when she heard horses in the yard. After dark, which was unusual, multiple horses, she went to the window. 3 riders she didn't recognize, and Harlan Pierce on the porch, speaking to them in the low voice he used when he didn't want to be overheard. She watched. The conversation lasted 10 minutes. The riders left. Pierce went back inside. That strode. July 31, 1871. Evening. 3 unknown riders. Spoke with Pierce on porch. Low voice. 10 minutes left south on the trail road. She stared at that entry. She did not know what it meant. She knew it meant something. She thought about the county land commissioner. She thought about Harold Garrett's name and the way Pierce had gone still when she said it. She thought about a signed slip in her notebook and Earl Dobbs's testimony and Daniel Hale's eyewitness account of the flower. She thought, whatever he's planning it fast. She thought, I need to move faster. She sat at the kitchen table after the dishes were done. In the dark. And she thought about Wyatt Mercer, out on the trail somewhere between Dawson Creek and Billings, with 600 head of cattle and no way to know what was happening here. She thought, he doesn't need to know. This is not his fight to finish. He started it with her. She had to finish it herself. She pulled out a blank page from the back of the notebook. She began to write, not to Wyatt, to Harold Garrett. She wrote carefully, in her best hand, the way she had been taught by a woman in Billings who believed that penmanship was a form of respect for the reader. For the subject, for yourself. She wrote the dates, the amounts, the names. She wrote what she had seen and what she had documented, and what Earl Dobbs had seen and what Daniel Hale had seen. She wrote about May Sutton, who had been here before her and had left with nothing and no proof. She wrote for 2 hours. When she was done, she had 4 pages. She folded them carefully. She wrote on the outside, "For the attention of Harold Garrett, County Land Commissioner." She put it inside the notebook. She looked at the notebook for a long moment. Then she looked at the clock on the kitchen shelf. It was nearly midnight. The drive to town was 4 hours by foot, 2 hours on horseback. She did not have a horse. She thought about Earl Dobbs, who had said, "I'll say it out loud," and who had a horse. She thought about Daniel Hale, who was 19 years old, and had said, "I'll write it down." She thought about Clara Whitman, who had come through her back door and sat at her table, said, "You're working somewhere that doesn't deserve you." She thought, "I am not May Sutton." May Sutton was alone. "I am not alone." She went to the back door. She looked at the dark yard. She breathed in. She breathed out. She knocked on Earl Dobbs's bunkhouse window at 12:15 in the morning. And when he came to the window looking alarmed, she held up the folded pages and said, "I need to get to town. I need your horse. And I need you to come with me." Earl Dobbs looked at the pages. He looked at her burned hands. He looked at her face. He said, "Give me 5 minutes to get my boots." They rode out before the ranch stirred. Earl Dobbs had his horse saddled in 4 minutes, which told Rosalie he had been half expecting this or something like it, and had been sleeping lighter than usual because of it. Daniel Hale appeared from the bunkhouse before they reached the gate. Boots half-laced, his written account folded in his shirt pocket. And he looked at Earl, and Earl looked at him, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying. Earl had a second horse, a working mare he'd bought himself, and kept in the south pasture. Daniel took her. Rosalie rode behind Earl. They went south on the trail road at a pace that covered ground without announcing itself. And the Montana dark was deep and warm around them, and the stars were extraordinary, and Rosalie held the notebook against her chest with one burned hand and kept her jaw set and did not look back at the ranch. She had made her decision. Looking back was not part of it. They reached town at 2:15 in the morning. Harold Garrett lived above his office on the main street, a practical arrangement for a man who handled land disputes and county record, and the occasional matter that required official attention before business hours. Earl knew which window was his. Earl had apparently known Harold Garrett for 11 years, which was information Rosalie filed without comment, because the night had already contained more surprises than she had room to process sequentially. Earl threw a small stone at the window. A light appeared. The window opened. Harold Garrett was a compact man in his late 50s with the alert eyes of someone who had learned long ago that middle-of-the-night visitors usually meant something that couldn't wait. He looked down at the three of them, one large woman with burned hands and a notebook pressed to her chest. One weathered ranch hand he'd known for 11 years. One boy who looked like he hadn't finished growing. "Earl," he said. "Harold," Earl said, "we need to talk. Tonight." Harold Garrett looked at them for a moment. "Give me 2 minutes," he said. He was down in 90 seconds. They sat in his office, Rosalie across from his desk, Earl and Daniel flanking her, the lamp turned up enough to read by, and Rosalie placed the notebook on the desk and the 4 folded pages and the signed slip from Harlan Pierce's hand and Earl's written account and Daniel's written account. And she laid them out in order, and she talked. She talked for 40 minutes without stopping. She talked the way she had learned to talk that first afternoon at the dining room table, with Wyatt beside her precisely. With specific dates and amounts and names, with the controlled emotion of a woman who has decided that clarity matters more than release. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She laid out 4 years and 3 months of a life at Dawson Creek Ranch the way you lay out evidence. Which is what it was. Harold Garrett listened. He read the signed slip. He read Earl's account. He read Daniel's account. He went through the notebook slowly, page by page, and when he got to the entry about May Sutton, he stopped and looked up. "May Sutton," he said. 3 years ago." Rosalie went still. "She came to you," she said. "She did," Harold said. She had almost nothing. Pierce had gotten ahead of her, had already filed a complaint claiming she'd stolen from ranch stores. "By the time she came to me, the record was already against her." He set the notebook down. "I couldn't do anything. She didn't have proof." The room was quiet. "I have proof," Rosalie said. "You have a notebook," Harold said. Not dismissively, carefully. "Personal record. Witness corroboration on most entries." "She has 2 witnesses," Earl said. "On specific incidents," Harold said. The flower, yes, Daniel's account of seeing Calvin move it is significant. The fire is harder. Your note about his cuff. Rosalie credible. But not provable. Rosalie looked at him. But the flower is enough, she said. Harold folded his hands on the desk. The flower, combined with Pierce's own signed statement acknowledging the doc and the justification. Combined with Daniel's eyewitness account of Calvin moving those sacks. Yes, he said. That's a documented case of false accounting used to penalize a worker. That is something I can act on. And May Sutton, Rosalie said. Harold looked at the notebook. If May Sutton could be located and would give a statement, he said slowly. And if her account corroborates the pattern you've documented here, the supply discrepancies. The false ledger entries, then, what you have is not an isolated incident. You have a practice, a deliberate, repeated practice. He looked at her. That's a different conversation. May Sutton is in Billings, Earl said. Rosalie and Harold both looked at him. She wrote to me, Earl said, with the slightly defensive air of a man revealing something he'd been sitting on. After she left. Twice, I know where she is. The silence that followed had the texture of a room in which something important has just shifted. Earl, Rosalie said. I should have done something sooner, he said. He was looking at his hands. I know it. I've known it. But she was gone, and I thought he stopped. I thought it was over. I thought Pierce would let it be. I didn't know he'd do it again. Rosalie looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the cost of naming what he'd done, the years of silence. The mornings of thank you that never quite made it to the kitchen. The night he'd gone quiet after Calvin's warning. She thought about all of it. She let it go. Can you write to her, she said. Tonight? Ask her if she'll give a statement to Harold. Tonight, Earl said. Yes. Harold Garrett sat back in his chair. He looked at the spread of documents on his desk, the notebook. The accounts, the signed slip, 4 pages of Rosalie's careful handwriting. He looked at the 3 people across from him. I'm going to ride to Dawson Creek Ranch in the morning, he said. Officially. I'll need all of this. He gestured at the desk. I'll need your testimony in person, both of you. He looked at Daniel. Yours especially on the flower. That's the clearest documentation of deliberate fraud. Daniel nodded. He was pale but steady. What happens to them? Rosalie said. Pierce and Calvin. That depends on what May Sutton says, Harold said. And on whether Pierce tries to get ahead of this before I get there. He paused. Which he may. I want you 3 back at the ranch before sunrise. I need things to look normal until I arrive. Rosalie looked at him. You want me to go back, she said. For 8 hours, Harold said. Can you do that? She thought about the black wall. She thought about the cracked wooden bowl she'd thrown away. She thought about 4 years of marks on the inside of a cabinet door. Yes, she said. I can do 8 hours. They rode back in the deep blue hour before dawn. And Rosalie sat behind Earl on the horse and held the notebook. Harold had made copies of the critical pages and kept the signed slip and the written accounts. Returning the notebook to her with the careful handling of someone who understood its value, and she looked at the sky going pale at the edges, and she thought about Wyatt Mercer on the trail road south. 600 head of cattle and a crew of men, and the particular silence of a man who said what he meant and then let it stand. She thought, I wish you could see this. She thought. I'll tell you when you get back. She went into the kitchen at 4:15. The same time she always went in, and she made the fire, and she started the bread, and she made the coffee. And by 5:45 the kitchen smelled exactly like it always smelled. Which was the smell of a normal morning at Dawson Creek Ranch. Nothing was normal, but the biscuits were excellent. Calvin came in at 6 with the second shift, and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything. Which was its own kind of conversation. She saw him note her hands still pink, still slightly swollen from the burns, and she saw something move behind his eyes that was calculation dressed as nothing. He sat down, he ate, he left. Harlan Pierce did not come to the kitchen that morning. At 9:15, Harold Garrett rode into the Dawson Creek Ranch yard with a deputy she didn't recognize. And the whole operation shifted on its axis in the time it took for Harlan Pierce to come onto the porch and see who it was. Rosalie watched from the kitchen window. She watched Harlan Pierce's face go through several things in quick succession: surprise, then the controlled mask that replaced surprise, then something underneath the mask that she had never seen on him before. Something that looked like fear. Harold Garrett tied his horse and came up the porch steps with the unhurried authority of a man who has paperwork and knows how to use it. Harlan said, "Harold, this is unexpected." "I imagine it is," Harold said. "I'd like to talk inside." They went in. Rosalie stood at the stove and breathed. Earl came to the kitchen door 20 minutes later. "He's asking for the supply ledgers," Earl said. "All of them." Rosalie nodded. "Calvin," she said. "In the yard," Earl said. "He doesn't know yet." "He'll know soon," she said. "Yes." She looked at Earl. "How are you doing?" she said. Earl made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Been better," he said. "Been a lot worse." He looked at her. "Waiting is the hard part," she said. "Always is," he said. He went back to the yard. She waited. Calvin Rhodes figured it out at 10:45, when Harold Garrett's deputy came to find him in the feed barn and asked him to come to the main house. She heard it from the kitchen, heard Calvin's voice go up in the particular way voices go up when a man has been caught in a thing he was certain he'd gotten away with, and she stood at the work table and held both hands flat on the surface and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth. Steady, measured, the way you breathe when you've been waiting a long time for something, and it's finally happening. 22 minutes later, Calvin Rhodes walked out of the main house, looking like a different person than the man who had walked in. Something had gone out of him, some quality of certainty, of territorial confidence, of being the second most important man in every room. He walked across the yard with the deputy beside him, and he did not look at the kitchen window, and he did not look at the yard around him, and he did not, as far as Rosalie could see, look at anything. He was gone from the yard by 11. At 11:30, Harold Garrett knocked on the kitchen door. He came in and sat at the work table and laid his hands flat in front of him, the way a man lays his hands when he's about to say something he wants received carefully. "Pierce is going to make this difficult," he said. "I know," Rosalie said. "He's agreed to repay the docked wages," Harold said. "Full amount today in coin. The flour fraud is documented well enough that he has no choice if he refuses, and we go to formal proceedings. Daniel's testimony puts Calvin in direct violation of ranch accounting law and Pierce as the authorizing party." He paused. "He's trying to keep Calvin's involvement separate from himself. Is that going to work?" Rosalie said. "Not if May Sutton gives a statement," Harold said. "If her account matches your documentation, and I think it will, then Pierce authorized the same practice twice, with two different women in the same position. That's a pattern. And patterns have legal weight." He looked at her. "Earl is writing to her today? He should have the letter done by noon," Rosalie said. Harold nodded. "There's something else," he said. She waited. "Pierce had visitors last night," Harold said. 3 men. "I know who they are. He was trying to arrange a land transfer, a portion of the east property. He's moving assets, anticipating that something was coming." Harold looked at her directly. "He knew you had documentation before I arrived this morning." Someone told him. Rosalie thought about the notebook. About Calvin searching her shelf. About the 3 riders on the porch. "He's known since at least a week ago," she said. "He's been trying to find what I had, and when he couldn't find it, he decided to move money instead of fighting it," Harold said. "Which is, I will tell you frankly, the action of a man who believes he's going to lose." He paused. "It's also the action of a man with resources, which means this isn't finished." "What does finished look like?" she said. Harold was quiet for a moment. "Finished looks like formal proceedings, where May Sutton's account is entered into record, and Pierce's pattern of conduct is officially documented." That takes time. Weeks, possibly months. He looked at her. You would need to be available for that. You would need to still be in the county. Rosalie thought about Clara Whitman. She thought about the East Road restaurant, the conversation over coffee, the way Clara had looked at her hands and said the woman who made this deserves a real kitchen. I can be in the county, she said. I won't be at this ranch. Harold nodded. That's fair. He stood. He took a pouch from his coat pocket and set it on the work table in front of her. Docked wages, he said. Pierce paid without argument when I put it to him in writing. He understood the alternative. Rosalie looked at the pouch. She picked it up. It was heavier than she expected. She thought, 3 months of wages. 3 months of being told. She had taken something she'd never touched. Had mismanaged something that had been deliberately removed. Had been responsible for a loss that was constructed specifically to diminish her. 3 months of wages in coin in her hand. Her eyes were burning. She did not blink, she said. Harold Garrett picked up his hat. You did the work, he said. I just applied the paperwork. He looked at her one more time, the steady, assessing look of a man who has been in official business long enough to know the difference between people who talk about doing the right thing and people who actually do it. At cost in the dark at midnight on a borrowed horse. You're a remarkable woman, Miss Bennett. He went out. Rosalie stood in the kitchen. She set the pouch down. She pressed both burned hands flat on the work table. She breathed. And then, for the first time since the morning of July the 11th, when a man named Wyatt Mercer had stood in her kitchen doorway and asked her name, she let herself feel the full weight of what she had been carrying, not to fall under it, but to feel it, to acknowledge it, to let it be real for exactly as long as it needed to be, before she put it down and moved forward. It took about 4 minutes. Then she wiped her face with her apron. She picked up the pouch. She went to the cabinet door and looked at the column of marks: 4 years. 3 months, 11 days, and the 3 words she'd written 8 days ago in the corner. Not to done. She took the pencil from the shelf. Below the 3 words she wrote 2 more, but now. She put the pencil down. She packed her things in 40 minutes. She didn't have much. She'd never had much. What she had was the notebook, the wages, a spare dress, her mother's letter, her good knife, the one she'd bought her teller in the year before her mother died. Kept sharp, kept private, the best tool she owned, and the small packet of dried sage from the patch behind the root cellar, which she was taking because she'd grown it and it was hers. She was closing her bag when Earl knocked on the doorframe. He stood there with his hat in his hands, looking at the bag. Looking at her back, he said. Rosalie went still. That's not possible. You sent the letter 2 hours ago. I didn't send a letter, Earl said. I sent Daniel to Billings on the fast horse at 5 this morning. Before Garrett arrived, I told him to bring May here if she'd come. He paused. She came. Rosalie stared at him. She's outside, Earl said. She wants to talk to you. There was a long moment. Then Rosalie set her bag down and walked to the door. May Sutton was a woman in her mid-30s, thin in the way of someone who'd been stretched by difficulty rather than design. With steady eyes and the particular composure of someone, survived something and made peace with the fact that it had cost them. She was standing in the yard with Daniel Hale beside her. And when she saw Rosalie, she looked at her for a long moment, and then she said, Simply he did the same thing to you. Yes, Rosalie said. The flour, and the sage, or whatever ingredient you used that was worth something. Yes, May nodded slowly. She looked at the main house. I should have fought it, May said. I didn't have anyone who would stand with me. I thought. She stopped. I thought it was my word against his. I thought nobody would believe me. I believed you, Earl said. From the doorway. I'm sorry I didn't say it sooner. May looked at him. Something moved across her face, not forgiveness exactly. Not yet. but the acknowledgement that forgiveness was a territory she could see from where she was standing. "Harold Garrett is inside," Rosalie said. "He wants your statement. It needs to be formal, written, witnessed. It will go into record. It will be used against Pierce in any proceedings." "I know," May said. Daniel explained. She looked at Rosalie. "Are you afraid?" Rosalie thought about it seriously. "I was," she said. "I'm not anymore." She paused. "He signed his own name on a slip of paper in front of me. He thought he was showing me he had the power. I thought, that's your signature. That's your handwriting. That's evidence." She looked at May. "He gave me the first real piece of evidence himself." May looked at her for another long moment. Then she said, "I'll give the statement." They went inside. May Sutton sat across from Harold Garrett for an hour and 20 minutes. And Rosalie sat beside her, and Earl sat beside Rosalie, and Daniel stood against the wall because there weren't enough chairs. And May talked. She talked with the specific, detailed precision of a woman who had spent 3 years carrying this account and had not allowed herself to forget a single date or a single name because she had always known, somewhere below conscious decision, that she might need it one day. When May finished, Harold Garrett looked at the pages he'd filled, and then he looked at Harlan Pierce's closed office door at the end of the hall, and his expression was the expression of a man completing a calculation. "This is enough," he said. Rosalie let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding for 3 years. She packed her bag and said goodbye to the kitchen. Not sentimentally, she was not a sentimental woman by nature. And 4 years of Dawson Creek Ranch had not made her more so. But she stood in the kitchen for a final moment and looked at the stove, which she had woken before sunrise to light every morning for 4 years, and the work table, where she had kneaded more bread than she could count, and the small window above it, where she had watched Wyatt Mercer ride into the yard on a bay horse with a white blaze, and felt, without knowing why, that something was about to change. She looked at the cabinet door. She did not need to read the marks. She knew the count. She closed the kitchen door behind her. Earl Dobbs and Daniel Hale walked her out to the road. Earl had written a reference half a page in his large, careful handwriting, describing her work in terms that were plainly truthful, and therefore more valuable than flattery. Daniel had said nothing about what came next for him, but he was standing straight in a way that he hadn't been standing when he'd first come to her kitchen door 2 weeks ago. At the road's edge, Earl said, "Where are you going?" "East Road," Rosalie said. "Restaurant about 2 miles out." He nodded. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "For midnight. For the horse." "For May." "Should have been sooner," he said. "It was when it was," she said. "That's enough." She picked up her bag. She walked east. The road was warm under the morning sun, and the sage was in the air around her, and she carried her bag in one hand and her notebook in the other, and she did not look back at Dawson Creek Ranch, because there was nothing behind her that she needed to see, and everything in front of her that she had not yet reached. She had walked 40 minutes when she heard hoofbeats behind her. Fast hoofbeats. She turned. It was a bay horse with a white blaze. And on the horse, sitting the saddle the way he sat everything unhurried, deliberate, like a man who had learned the hard way that some things are worth slowing down for, was Wyatt Mercer. He pulled up beside her. He looked at her bag. He looked at her burned hands. He looked at her face, which was composed and tired and more present than he had ever seen it. He said, "The drive finished 2 days early." "I see that," she said. "I went to the ranch," he said. "Earl told me where you were going. Told me what happened." He looked at her hands. "The fire. It's healing," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You went to Garrett," he said. "Midnight. 3 witnesses. 2 witnesses," she said. "Earl and Daniel." Earl said 3. He counted May Sutton. She looked up at him. Something moved across her face, something complicated and warm and not entirely steady. "May came," she said. "Earl sent Daniel to Billings before I even knew he'd done it. Wyatt nodded slowly. That's what happens, he said, when somebody starts standing up. Other people remember they know how. Rosalie looked at him. She looked at this man on a bay horse in a warm Montana morning, who had come to Dawson Creek Ranch to negotiate a cattle drive, and had asked her name and sat beside her at a table and put a notebook in her hands and gone to Clara Whitman before she even knew there was a Clara Whitman. And she felt something in her chest that she had been not naming for 3 weeks settle into its actual name the way a thing settles when it finally finds the right place. She didn't say it. She wasn't ready for that yet. But she didn't push it back down either. "Walk with me," she said. Wyatt stepped down from the horse. He led the horse by the reins. He walked beside her on the east road. And the sun was warm and the sage was in the air. And 2 miles ahead of them was a small restaurant on the east road run by a widow named Clara Whitman, who needed a cook worth having. And Rosalie Bennett walked toward it with her bag in one hand and her notebook in the other, and the person she was becoming moving just slightly ahead of her, showing her the way. Clara Whitman was waiting on the porch when they came up the east road. She had her arms crossed and her eyes sharp, and the expression of a woman who has been in business long enough to know that when things start moving, they tend to move all at once. She looked at Rosalie. She looked at the bag. She looked at Wyatt Mercer leading the bay horse, and she looked at the burned hands, and she said nothing for a moment. Just took the full picture in the way a careful person takes things in completely before speaking. Then she said, "You're earlier than I expected." "Things moved fast," Rosalie said. "They usually do once they start." Clara looked at her hands. "Can you work with those?" "Yes," Rosalie said. "Does it hurt?" "Yes," Rosalie said. Clara nodded. "Good answer. Come inside." She looked at Wyatt. "You staying?" Not unfriendly. Just direct. The way Clara Whitman was direct about everything. Wyatt looked at Rosalie. Rosalie looked at him. "For a while," he said. Clara turned and went inside, and they followed her. And that was how Rosalie Bennett began the next chapter of her life, through a plain door on an east road in Montana Territory, with burned hands and a notebook and a man walking one step behind her who had learned, in the weeks since he'd first seen her eat scraps from a broken bowl. The restaurant was small. 6 tables. A proper stove, a pantry that was better stocked than the Dawson Creek kitchen had ever been, and a good deal cleaner than it had been in the last month of Calvin Rhodes's reign, over the supply ledger. Clara showed her everything in 20 minutes, what was where, what needed doing, what the regulars ordered, what she'd been cooking herself since her last cook left, and why it wasn't working. "I'm not a cook," Clara said plainly. "I'm a businesswoman who can make adequate food." "Adequate isn't what I'm trying to build." "What are you trying to build?" Rosalie said. Clara looked at her. "Something worth crossing the territory for," she said. Rosalie looked at the stove. She looked at the pantry. She thought about the sage in her bag. "I'll need a few things I don't see here," she said. "And I'll need to know your budget before I plan the week." "Practical," Clara said, with the tone of someone awarding a point. "Necessary," Rosalie said. Clara told her the budget. Rosalie did the arithmetic in her head the way she had always done it. Fast and accurate, the kind of mental calculation that came from years of making very little stretch very far, and she told Clara what she could produce for that number, and what it would take to produce more, and what the difference would mean for the restaurant's reputation within 60 days. Clara listened without interrupting. When Rosalie finished, Clara said, "When can you start?" "This afternoon," Rosalie said. "If I can get to town for 2 items before noon." "Take my horse," Clara said. "Wyatt can go with you." Rosalie looked at Clara. "You're trusting me with your horse after knowing me 40 minutes. I trusted you after knowing you 40 seconds, Clara said. "Wyatt vouched for you, and I trust Wyatt's judgment." But I'd already decided before he opened his mouth. A woman who walks 2 miles on a burned hand with a notebook pressed to her chest like it's the most important thing she owns is a woman worth trusting. She paused. Is it the most important thing? Rosalie looked at the notebook in her hand. She thought about what was in it. 4 years of documentation. Dates and names and missing flour and a fire and Earl Dobbs saying I'll say it out loud and Daniel Hale saying I saw Calvin move the sacks and May Sutton crossing 40 miles to give a statement to a county commissioner. She thought about what it had cost to fill those pages. She thought about what it had bought. It was, she said. It isn't anymore. She set the notebook on the kitchen shelf between the salt jar and the pepper tin, where it could stay without being in the way. And she picked up the list she'd started writing in her head from the moment she walked through the door. And she went to get Clara's horse. Wyatt rode beside her to town. They rode the first half-mile without talking, which was one of the things she had learned about him, that he did not fill silence with noise. That he understood silence as its own kind of communication and was comfortable in it, in a way that most people were not. She had come to value that. She had come to value a great deal about him. Quietly, over weeks, the way you come to value things that don't announce themselves. How long before Garrett moves formally against Pierce? She said. Depends on May's statement and whether Pierce tries to contest it, Wyatt said. Harold's thorough. He won't move until it's solid. But it'll move. And Calvin's a different matter, Wyatt said. He's the one who physically moved the flour. He's the one whose cuff you saw. Earl's testimony about where he came from during the fire that matters. Even without direct proof. He paused. Men like Calvin make the mistake of thinking they're the instrument and not the architect. That they can hide behind the man giving orders. Sometimes they can. This time I don't think so. Rosalie thought about Calvin's face in the yard after the fire. The deliberate, unhurried pace of a man establishing an alibi. The way he'd said accident without being asked if it was one. He's going to say Pierce told him to do everything, she said. Yes, Wyatt said. And Pierce is going to say Calvin acted without authorization. Yes, Wyatt said. And Harold Garrett is going to have both their signed names on documents that contradict both their stories. And May Sutton's statement establishing the same pattern existed before either of them thought to coordinate their excuses. He looked at her. You did that. The documentation. Without it, it's your word against theirs, and you're a woman without property or legal standing, and they know it. I know it, she said. The notebook changed that, he said. She looked at the road ahead. You told me to keep it, she said. You kept it, he said. Those aren't the same thing. They rode into town, and she got what she needed, dried peppers. A specific cut of beef that Clara's regular supplier had, and that she'd already planned 3 dishes around, and they rode back and she went directly to the kitchen. And by 2 in the afternoon the restaurant smelled like something that had not existed in that building before she arrived. The first customer who came in at supper was a cattle driver from the north route. Trail dusty and hungry, who ordered whatever was hot and ate it with the focused silence of genuine appreciation. And when he finished, he looked toward the kitchen and said, loudly enough to carry, "Who cooked that?" Clara looked toward the kitchen. "My cook," she said. "Rosalie Bennett." He nodded the way people nod when they've just encountered something better than they expected. "Tell her it's the best thing I've had since." He stopped. "Tell her it's the best thing I've had." Clara looked at Rosalie through the kitchen doorway. Rosalie looked back. She didn't smile. She was already working on the next dish. But something in her eyes, some quality that had been packed down and carefully managed for 4 years and 3 months, lifted slightly. The way a window lifts when someone finally decides the room needs air. That was the first night. By the end of the first week, all 6 tables were full at supper. By the end of the second week, Clara had added 2 more tables and moved one against the wall to make room, and was turning people away on Friday evenings. By the end of the first month, travelers on the East Road were stopping specifically because someone farther back had mentioned the restaurant, and the someone farther back had heard about it from someone else. Which was how a reputation built in territory, where word of mouth was the only advertisement that mattered. Rosalie cooked. She cooked the way she had always been capable of cooking, when nobody was controlling what she had access to, or how much she was permitted to eat, or what she was allowed to take pride in. She cooked with everything she had, every skill, every instinct, every piece of knowledge accumulated over a lifetime of feeding people and loving the way good food could make a person feel seen even when nothing else could. She did not think about Dawson Creek Ranch. She thought about it once. In the third week, when a ranch hand came in for supper, and she recognized him not by name. One of the men from the second shift. Someone who had laughed at Tommy Greer's joke about the doorway, and he sat down and looked at the menu Clara had written on the board, and he looked around, and then his eyes found her in the kitchen doorway, and he went very still. She looked at him. She said, "What can I get you tonight?" He said, quietly, "Whatever you recommend, ma'am." She brought him the stew. He ate every bite. He left a larger tip than the meal cost. She did not feel triumph, exactly. She felt something cleaner than triumph, the satisfaction of a you, and no longer needs anyone else's recognition to confirm it, but receives it when it comes without bitterness and without performance. She wrote in the notebook that night, not documentation, not dates and names and evidence, but something different. Something she'd never used the notebook for before. She wrote, "I used to cook to prove I deserved to be here. I cook now because I love it. I didn't realize how different those two things feel until I felt the second one." She read it back. She closed the notebook. Then came the morning. 6 weeks after she'd walked through Clara's door. When Harold Garrett arrived at the restaurant, before it opened. He came in through the front and sat at the nearest table, and Clara brought him coffee. Without being asked, she had that quality. Clara, of understanding what people needed before they said it. Which was part of why she and Rosalie worked together as well as they did, and Harold wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at Rosalie. "Proceedings started yesterday," he said. Rosalie sat down across from him. "Both of them?" she said. "Pierce and Calvin both." Harold nodded. "May's statement was entered into record 3 days ago. Combined with your documentation and the signed wage doc slip and Daniel Hale's eyewitness account of the flour, the pattern is established beyond what Pierce can contest." He paused. "He's trying. He hired a lawyer from Helena. But the lawyer looked at the evidence and told him, I've been informed that his best option is to settle." "Settle how?" Rosalie said. "Compensate May Sutton for her wrongful dismissal," Harold said. "Compensate you for the full value of wages manipulated over 4 years. Not just the 3 months explicitly docked. Acknowledge the fraudulent accounting in writing." He looked at her steadily. "It's not a criminal proceeding. He won't go to jail for this. The bar for that is higher, and what we have, while substantial, doesn't clear it. But his name goes into county record as a party to documented labor fraud. That follows him. In a territory where your reputation is your credit. That matters." Rosalie thought about May Sutton, who had left in the middle of the night with nothing and no proof and spent 3 years in Billings, carrying an account nobody had believed. "And May," she said. "May gets her compensation," Harold said. "She also gets a formal record that her departure was the result of false accusation rather than genuine misconduct. That record exists, officially. Anyone who about May Sutton can now be pointed to that record." Rosalie was quiet for a moment. She thought about what that meant. Not for herself, for May. For a woman who had come 40 miles on a day's notice because Earl Dobbs sent a 19-year-old boy on a fast horse to ask her. And who had sat across from Harold Garrett for an hour and 20 minutes and said every word she'd been carrying for 3 years. Clearly, completely, with the controlled precision of someone who had held the account intact, specifically, because she had always believed it might matter someday. She deserved that a long time ago, Rosalie said. She did, Harold said. You made it possible. Earl made it possible, Rosalie said. And Daniel. And May herself. Harold looked at her. You started it, he said, midnight, on a borrowed horse. With burned hands, he stood, picked up his hat, Pierce's lawyer will contact you about the wage settlement within the week. Don't accept the first number. You have leverage and he knows it. He left. Clara set a cup of coffee in front of Rosalie. Rosalie looked at it. Don't accept the first number, Clara said, in the tone of a woman who had negotiated her share of agreements and found that advice universally applicable. Rosalie almost laughed. She did not almost laugh very often. It felt like something she was relearning, the way you relearn a physical skill after injury carefully. Testing the range of it, finding it was still there. What do you know about negotiating with lawyers? Rosalie said. I know that the first number is always what they hope you'll take, Clara said. And the second number is what they actually plan to offer. And the third number, if you get there, is what the thing is actually worth. She sat down across from her. I'll sit with you if you want. Rosalie looked at her. This woman who had come through her kitchen door 6 weeks ago, because Wyatt Mercer had come to her restaurant and said there's a cook on Dawson Creek who deserves better than what she's getting. This woman who had handed over her horse after 40 minutes, and her kitchen after 40 seconds, and her trust in the complete, unqualified way that some people extend trust not recklessly, but from a position of knowing their own judgment and standing behind it. I'd like that, Rosalie said. She got to the third number. Pierce's lawyer arrived at the restaurant on a Tuesday, which Rosalie noted as a choice. A lawyer who comes to your workplace rather than summoning you to his is a lawyer who already knows the power in the room isn't entirely on his side. Clara sat at the corner table with her coffee and her ledger, and her expression of a woman doing her own work who happened to be present, which was entirely intentional. The first number was insulting. Rosalie said so, plainly without anger. The second number was better. Rosalie said it was closer, and told him what she actually wanted, and why the documentation supported it, and what Harold Garrett's formal record said about the established pattern of wage manipulation, which meant the liability extended further back than the 3 months explicitly documented, and they both knew it. The lawyer looked at her for a long moment. He wrote a third number. She looked at it. She looked at Clara. Clara made no expression whatsoever, which was its own kind of expression. Rosalie looked at the lawyer. Add May Sutton's compensation to that figure, she said. Written into the same agreement. Not a separate negotiation, the same one. Today finalized. The lawyer looked genuinely surprised. Miss Bennett, May Sutton's settlement is a separate. It's the same pattern, Rosalie said. Harold Garrett's record says so. One agreement, both parties compensated. Signed today. Or we go to formal proceedings and you explain to your client why he didn't take the option that kept his name out of the territorial newspaper. There was a long silence. The lawyer picked up his pen. He wrote the agreement. He included May Sutton. He signed it. Rosalie signed it. Clara witnessed it. When the lawyer left, Clara looked at Rosalie across the table. Well, Clara said. Well, Rosalie said. You just negotiated for a woman who wasn't in the room, Clara said. She should have been in the room 3 years ago, Rosalie said. This was the least I could do. Clara looked at her for a moment, with the expression she sometimes had, the expression of a woman who has been in the world long enough to know that what Rosalie had just done was not common, and who found it worth remarking on, even if she wasn't going to make a ceremony of it. I'm raising your wages, Clara said. Starting this week. Rosalie looked at her. The restaurant is doing well enough to support it, Clara said briskly. And I should have offered more at the start, but I didn't know yet what you were worth, and now I do. She stood. Don't argue with me. I'll lose patience. I wasn't going to argue, Rosalie said. Good, Clara said. We open in an hour. Rosalie went to the kitchen. She stood at the stove. She thought about Harlan Pierce in his office, looking at her with those eyes the color of water that hadn't moved in a long time. Saying her dietary situation requires management, saying she'd received special accommodations, saying things go back to normal now. She thought about the way he had pronounced the word ideas when he said the Mercer situation gave her ideas. as though ideas were something that happened to women, the way bad weather happened to buildings from outside. Against their nature, something to be managed back into order. She thought about how wrong he had been. The ideas had always been hers. The worth had always been hers. The skill and the instinct and the knowledge and the capacity, all of it. Always hers. What Wyatt Mercer had done was not give her those things. What he had done was stand in her kitchen doorway and ask her name and refuse to look away. And in doing so had made it slightly harder for her to look away from herself. The rest she had done. She started the fire, she started the bread. She thought, I want to tell him that. I want to say it out loud to the person who should hear it. Wyatt had been in and out over the 6 weeks. The nature of his work took him away and brought him back. The rhythm of cattle drives and contracts and territory that needed covering. He came to the restaurant when he was in the area. He ate at the table nearest the kitchen. He talked to her the same way he had always talked to her, directly. With attention, like she was someone worth listening to. He had not said the thing that sat between them. Neither had she. They were, both of them, careful people in their own ways, people who had learned that saying things too fast sometimes broke them before they had a chance to become real. He came in on a Thursday evening 3 days after the lawyer, during the supper rush, and there were no tables open, so he leaned against the wall near the kitchen door and waited. And when the first table cleared, he sat, and Clara brought him coffee without being asked, and he ate the meal Rosalie sent out. She always sent the meal she thought he'd want rather than waiting for him to order. And he always ate it without comment, which was its own kind of conversation. After the last table left, he was still there. Clara looked at Rosalie. Clara went upstairs. Rosalie came out of the kitchen with her apron still on, and sat across from him, and they looked at each other for a moment in the quiet of a restaurant after close, with the smell of supper still in the air and the lamp burning low. Garrett told me about the settlement, Wyatt said. Both names on one agreement. It was the right thing, she said. It was, he said. It was also the thing most people wouldn't have thought to do. He looked at her. How do you feel? She thought about it. Like myself, she said. Like the version of myself I'd forgotten I was. He nodded. She looked at him. You went to Clara before you told me she existed, she said. You went and made sure it was real before you put it in my hands. I did, he said. Nobody had ever done that for me before, she said. Thought about what I actually needed rather than what would make them feel useful. Wyatt was quiet. I need to say something to you, she said. He waited. What you did starting that morning in the kitchen. All of it didn't give me anything I didn't already have. I want you to know I understand that. My worth wasn't something you created. She held his gaze. But you made it harder for me to keep pretending I didn't have it. And that she stopped, found the word. That mattered. More than I know how to say. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. He said you would have gotten there. Maybe, she said. Later. With more damage first. She looked at her hands, the burns healed now to faint pink lines across her palms. The knuckles less cracked, the skin stronger from 6 weeks of cooking in a kitchen that was hers to run the right way. I'd like to not wonder about later. I'd like to be here in the actual right now and say thank you to your face. Clearly received, he said. Serious. The way he received most things. She looked at him. He looked at her. I'd like you to stay, she said. Not as someone passing through. Not cattle drive to cattle drive. She kept her voice steady. I know that's not what your work is. I know it's a lot to ask. You're not asking me to stop working, he said. No, she said. I'm asking you to come back to the same place when you're done. Wyatt Mercer was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee cup. He looked at the kitchen door she'd come through. He looked at her. I've been coming back to this table for 6 weeks, he said. I know, she said. That's not nothing, he said. No, she said, it isn't. He reached across the table. He set his hand over hers over the healed burns. over the flour-dusted knuckles, over the strong, working hands that had kneaded bread and hauled water, and gripped a bucket handle in a fire, and pressed flat on a work table, while she breathed through the hardest moments of her life. He held her hand the way he did most things, fully present. Without performance, like this was a thing worth doing, and he intended to do it right. "I'll come back to the same place," he said. She looked at his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held his. "Good," she said. They sat there in the quiet of Clara Whitman's restaurant on the East Road in Montana Territory. With the lamp burning low, and the supper smell fading, and the summer night coming in through the cracks in the walls. Two people who had learned the hard way that worth was not something others assigned to you, but something you already carried. And that the right person wasn't the one who told you it existed, but the one who stood beside you while you found your way back to believing it. The months that followed moved the way good things move, not without difficulty, but with purpose. The restaurant grew, Clara expanded the dining room, and Rosalie expanded the menu, and they built something together that people came from 3 counties to experience. Rosalie hired 2 kitchen helpers, women from town who needed work and whom she paid properly. From the first day, at rates she had thought carefully about. And she told them both on their first morning, "You eat what you cook at the table I set for you, before service starts. Not after, not the scraps, the meal." They looked at her the way she had looked at Wyatt that first morning. Like someone had asked a question nobody had asked them before. She understood that look. She intended to give them the answer a different way. May Sutton wrote in the autumn. She was in Billings, using the settlement to open a small boarding house. She wrote that the formal record had made it possible that when she'd applied for the loan, the county documentation clearing her name had been the thing that moved the lender from hesitation to agreement. She wrote, "I didn't know a piece of paper could give you your name back. But it did. Thank you for making it exist." Rosalie read the letter at the kitchen table before the morning shift. She held it for a moment. She put it in the notebook. Between the pages. She went to work. In the spring of 1872. On a morning when the range had gone green, and the sky was the particular blue of a country that has remembered how to breathe after a hard winter. Rosalie and Wyatt stood in front of Harold Garrett in his office and signed the papers that made the roadside inn officially theirs. The restaurant Clara was passing to them because her sister in Ohio needed her, and she was going. And she had looked at both of them and said, very simply, "It should be yours anyway." Clara left on a Tuesday. She hugged Rosalie in the way of women who understand each other without needing to explain themselves. And she said at the door, "Don't change the stew." "I won't," Rosalie said. "Change everything else if you want," Clara said. "But not the stew." She left. Rosalie and Wyatt stood in their restaurant, in the quiet of a Tuesday morning. And Wyatt looked at her, and she looked at him. And they said nothing for a moment, because some things are large enough that silence is the right response. Then she went to the kitchen. Wyatt went to the front, where there was a wooden board he'd made the previous week. Sanded smooth, the lettering burned in carefully by a man who was more skilled with his hands than he generally advertised. He hung it above the entrance. It said, "No one leaves hungry. No one leaves unseen." She saw it from the kitchen doorway. She looked at it for a long moment. She thought about a cracked wooden bowl and a broken biscuit pulled from a slop bucket. She thought about 30 men laughing through a wall while she stood in the dark and told herself it was enough. She thought about 4 years of marks on a cabinet door and a notebook pressed against her ribs, and Earl Dobbs putting his boots on at midnight, and Daniel Hale standing straight in the kitchen doorway, and May Sutton crossing 40 miles because someone finally asked her to come. She thought about a man in a kitchen doorway who asked her name and meant it. She thought, that woman in the dark kitchen, pressing her back against the wall. Eating cold scraps alone, she did not disappear. She did not get replaced. She grew into this. She grew into every inch of this. She went back to the stove. She started the fire. She started the bread. And Rosalie Bennett, who had once been invisible, who had once eaten from a broken bowl while the world feasted on everything she made, who had once believed that having a job was better than having nothing, not knowing yet that she deserved to have everything, stood in her own kitchen on a spring morning in Montana Territory and cooked. Finally and completely, as the woman she had always been. Not the woman someone else had decided she was. Not the woman 4 years of diminishment had tried to make her. The woman she had always, underneath all of it, already been. And that woman was extraordinary, and she knew it, and she never forgot it again.